A group of camels lay couched in a long, untidy row near the center of the camp, their legs folded beneath them, and their heavy heads swaying slowly from side to side. Each animal was already loaded, the bulky packs of bundled cloth, clay jars and leather sacks balanced and tied on the wooden saddle frames, though the drovers continued to move quietly among them, touching a rope here, pushing a knot there, murmuring the same soft syllables over and over. The guide, an older man in a faded wool robe the color of dry earth, stood a little apart from the others, holding a staff of his own and looking out toward the dunes with the same expression he had worn all afternoon, patient, unsurprised, as if the sand had already shown him exactly what the night would bring. You had walked this route with him before, or one very like it, and you knew that he would not speak until there was something that needed saying. You pulled the loose end of your headscarf across your face, leaving only your eyes uncovered, and the cloth still held the faint warmth of your own breath from the last time you adjusted it. Beneath your feet, the gravel was smooth and rounded, polished by 1,000 years of rare desert rain, and as you shifted your weight from one foot to the other, you could feel the stones pressing coolly through the thin soles of your sandals. Your staff, a simple length of acacia wood, smoothed by your own hands over many nights, rested lightly against your shoulder, and you let it stay there, knowing that soon enough it would be tapping the sand with every step. The air was so dry that it seemed to pull the moisture from your lips, and you licked them once, tasting salt and a trace of the mint tea you had drunk before sundown. One of the drovers, a young man with a strip of blue cloth tied around his upper arm, lifted a heavy water skin from a pile of supplies and hung it carefully on the wooden peg at the side of a saddle. The skin bulged and sloshed with a deep, glugging sound, and the camel nearest to it let out a long, slow breath that fluttered the loose skin of its soft palate, making a noise like a thick cloth being shaken once and then stilled. Another drover, older and broader, walked along the line carrying a small clay lamp with a single flame that flickered but never went out, touching each animal on the flank and murmuring a name that you did not catch. The lamp threw a warm, unsteady circle of light that caught the brass fittings on the saddles and made them glow for a moment before the darkness closed over them again. You watched all of this without any feeling of hurry, because there was no hurry. The caravan would leave when the guide decided it would leave, and not one moment sooner. The twilight deepened, and the orange smear on the horizon sank into a thin copper line, then into nothing. More stars appeared, first in the east, and then spreading upward and westward until the whole sky was thick with them. A fine dust of light that seemed to shimmer slightly if you looked at it without focusing. You tilted your head back and let your eyes wander across the constellations that you knew by heart, the broad curve that the guide called the camel's hump, the 3 bright points of the trader's staff, the small tight cluster that marked the north well. You had learned these names not from a book, but from many nights like this one, walking behind the same guide, listening to him point them out in his low, unhurried voice. Now you could find them yourself, and you did, tracing the lines between them as a way of letting your mind grow quiet. At some point the guide raised his staff just a few inches off the ground and let it fall again, a soft thump that was more a signal than a sound, and the drovers began to stir the camels. The animals rose in a series of slow rocking motions, first the hindquarters lifting, then the front, the whole great body swaying and settling as the legs straightened and locked into place. You heard the creak of leather, the soft groan of a wooden saddle frame adjusting to the shift of weight, and the gentle chime of the single brass bell that hung from the neck of the led camel. That bell was small, no larger than a child's fist, and it rang with a thin, clear note that carried only a short distance before the sand swallowed it. You would hear that note many thousands of times before the sun rose, and already it was becoming part of the background of the night, something you noticed without really noticing. You walked to your place near the rear of the column, where the last camel stood with its head turned slightly to watch you approach. Its eyes were large and dark and entirely calm, reflecting the starlight without any flicker of concern, and you reached out to touch the coarse hair on its shoulder, feeling the warmth of its body through the thick hide. The animal made a low, rumbling sound deep in its throat, a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a purr, and then it turned its head forward again, ready to follow the others. You adjusted the strap of your water skin so that it hung across your body without chafing, and you settled your staff in your right hand, the smooth wood cool against your palm. The guide took his position at the head of the line, and without any spoken command the lead camel stepped forward, its broad, padded feet sinking silently into the first loose sand. The other camels followed, one by one, the line stretching out like a slow, undulating ribbon against the dark plain, and you fell into step behind the last animal, your own footsteps beginning to soften as you left the gravel and entered the sand sea. The transition was almost imperceptible at first, a few small patches of sand scattered among the stones, then larger patches, then a continuous layer that shifted under your weight and received your footprints with a dry, sliding whisper. You looked down and saw that the sand was a deep, velvety blue-grey in the starlight, marked with the faint, wispy ripple patterns left by a wind that had blown days ago and not returned. The moon had not yet risen above the dunes behind you, so the world was lit only by the stars and by the faint glow of the sky itself, a soft ambient light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You could see the shapes of the dunes ahead, dark, rolling humps against the slightly lighter sky, and you could see the shadowy forms of the camels in front of you, their loads making them look broader and more solid than they really were. The guide's robe was almost invisible, a faint smudge of movement at the very front of the column, but you did not need to see him clearly. You only needed to follow the sound of the bell and the rhythm of the footsteps ahead. Your own breathing had already settled into a slow, easy pattern, and you found yourself counting the steps without meaning to, reaching 20 or 30 before the numbers dissolved and began again. The caravan climbed the first, long, wind-packed slope of a dune, and the angle of the ground changed so gradually that you hardly noticed the extra effort until you felt the muscles in your calves tighten slightly. The sand here was firmer, compacted by the wind into a surface that held your weight without giving way, and your footprints left shallow, crisp impressions that held their shape for a moment before crumbling at the edges. The guide's pace did not change. He walked with the same measured stride he had used on the flat ground, his staff touching the sand at regular intervals with a soft, rhythmic thump. You could hear the drovers speaking quietly to the camels, the same short phrases repeated again and again. So stand, good now, easy, easy. And the animals responded with small adjustments of their gait, a slight turn of the head, a slow blink of their long-lashed eyes. At the crest of the first dune you paused for a moment without being told to, looking back over the way you had come. The camp was already invisible, swallowed by the darkness, and the gravel plain was just a vague, darker expanse below the starry sky. Ahead of you, the dunes rolled away in all directions, their crests sharp and silver-edged where the starlight caught them, their hollows deep and black. You could see the faint, pale line of the caravan's track stretching back down the slope, and you knew that by morning the wind would erase even that small sign of your passage. The guide had already started down the far side of the dune, and the camels were following, their bodies tilting slightly forward as they descended. You turned and walked after them, your heels digging in a little to keep your balance on the downward slope, and the sand slid gently around your ankles, filling your sandals with a fine, cool grit that you would empty out later without thinking about it. For a long while, there was nothing but the walking. The dunes rose and fell in slow, rolling waves, and the caravan moved across them like a small ship crossing a wide sea. The moon had still not risen, but the sky in the east was beginning to show a very faint, pale lightning, so subtle that you could not be sure it was really there. The guide began to hum, a tuneless, repeating phrase of 3 notes, so quiet that you felt it more than heard it, a vibration in the air that seemed to come from the sand itself. One of the camels in the middle of the line shook its head, and the brass bell chimed twice in quick succession, the notes hanging in the still air for a moment before fading. A drover coughed once, a soft, muffled sound, and then the silence closed back over everything like a thick blanket being smoothed down at the edges. Your thoughts had become very simple, matching the rhythm of your steps. You noticed the way the sand changed color slightly from one dune to the next here, a warm brownish grey, there a cooler, almost blue-grey. and you noticed the small dark lines of wind ripples that ran across the surface like the grain of a piece of old wood. Sometimes you passed a patch of sand that was covered with tiny round depressions, each one no larger than a fingertip, and you knew that these were the marks left by a desert beetle that had passed this way hours or days before. You did not see the beetle itself, and you did not expect to. It was enough to see its tracks and to know that the desert was not as empty as it seemed. The guide's three-note hum continued, and you realized that you had been hearing it so long that it had become part of the landscape, as steady and unremarkable as the pulse of your own blood. After a time, that could have been an hour or could have been 3, the guide stopped at a place where the sand was firm and flat, a broad shelf between 2 low dune crests. He did not say anything, only raised his hand once and let it fall, and the camels halted in place, some of them lowering their heads to sniff at the sand, others simply standing with their eyes half closed. The drovers moved forward quietly to check the ropes and the loads, their hands moving by touch as much as by sight, and you took your water skin from your shoulder and pulled the wooden stopper. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of the leather bag, and you let it run over your tongue slowly, swallowing in small deliberate sips. The air was dry and cool, not cold, and it carried a faint scent of the crushed herbs that the drovers tucked into the saddle pads, a smell that was sharp and clean, like dried lavender but earthier. You caught the skin and hung it back across your body, and you walked a slow circle around the rear of the column, your staff making small round depressions in the sand that filled almost immediately with the fine grain sliding back into place. The guide was standing a little apart, looking up at the sky with the same patient expression, his head tilted back so that his face caught the starlight. You did not ask him what he was looking for. You knew that he was reading the sky in the same way that a sailor reads the sea, checking the positions of the stars against some internal map that had been laid down over decades of walking. After a short while, he lowered his head and resumed his pace, and the caravan moved on, the interruption slipping back into the deep silence of the night without leaving a ripple. You counted your steps again, reaching 50 this time before the numbers blurred, and you forgot to keep going, and the sound of your own footsteps became just another part of the quiet, like the creak of the saddle leather and the soft, rhythmic huff of the camels. The moon rose at last, lifting itself above the dark rim of the dunes behind you, and its light spilled across the sand as if poured slowly from a bowl. It was a little past full, just beginning to thin at one edge, and it was so bright that it washed out the fainter stars near it, leaving a pale silver halo that spread across a wide patch of sky. You did not turn to look at it directly. Instead, you noticed how your own shadow appeared in front of you, long and stretched, moving across the rippled surface like a quiet companion. The shadow of the camel ahead of you was even longer, a strange, distorted shape that bulged and contracted as the animal walked, and the shadow of your staff fell across the sand like a thin, dark line that pointed always forward. Everything was easier to see now, the curves of the dunes, the texture of the sand, the dark shapes of the camels' loads, and your pace became a little steadier as your eyes adjusted to the monochrome landscape. The column descended into a broad trough between 2 parallel ridges, and the dunes on either side rose up like the high, smooth walls of a quiet street. The sand in the bottom of the trough was scattered with small smooth pebbles that glowed like tiny moons under the high starlight, and you could hear the camels' feet crunching softly on them, a sound like dry cereal being pressed under a thumb. The guide changed directions slightly, bearing a little more to the left, and you understood that he was following a route invisible to anyone but himself, perhaps a line of harder sand, or a gap between 2 tall crests that would otherwise block the way. You passed a wind-carved ridge where the sand had formed delicate overlapping scallops, each one a perfect half-circle that caught the moonlight on its upper edge and held a deep shadow in its curve, and you thought about how long it must have taken for the wind to shape them, blowing steadily from the same direction for weeks or months or years. Then you stopped thinking about it and just looked, and the scalloped sand slid past and was replaced by another kind of surface, just as quiet and just as still. The drover with the blue cloth tied around his arm walked past you, moving from the middle of the column to the front, and he and the guide exchanged a few low words that you could not hear. The drover nodded and walked back, touching each camel on the shoulder as he passed, and you heard him say something soft and reassuring. Easy now. Easy to the animal, just ahead of you. The camel turned its head slightly and made a low, grumbling sound, then faced forward again, and the blue-clothed drover disappeared into the darkness ahead. You did not know what the message had been, and you did not need to know. The caravan continued, as it had before, and your watch continued with it, the same slow rhythm of steps and breath and bell and star. The night had settled into its deepest, stillest part by the time you reached a small well that the guide had been aiming for since the camp. It was nothing more than a low circle of rough stones set into the sand of the lowest point of a gentle hollow, its mouth covered by a heavy wooden plank with a large flat stone on top. The caravan stopped, and the drovers pulled the plank aside and drew up a leather bucket on a long, coiled rope. The water came up dark and cool, smelling of minerals and deep earth, and they poured it into a series of shallow wooden troughs for the camels, who drank with slow, deliberate sips, their lower lips curling back to reveal their blunt, yellow teeth. You refilled your water skin from a clay jug the guide handed you, and the water was noticeably cooler than what you had been carrying, with a faint, clean taste that made you want to drink more than you needed. You ate a small handful of dried dates and a piece of hard flatbread, chewing slowly while you sat on a rug that one of the drovers had spread on the sand. The dates were sweet and sticky, and the bread was dry and bland, and together they made a simple meal that was exactly what you wanted. The guide did not sit with you. He stood a little apart, looking first at the sky and then out toward the darker dunes on the far side of the hollow, and you saw him tilt his head slightly as if he were listening to something very far away. There was nothing to hear, only the quiet lapping of the camels, the soft murmur of the drovers, the faint whistle of a light breeze that had begun to stir from the north. But the guide kept listening for a long moment before he turned and walked back to the well. He spoke a few words to the head drover, and then the bucket was stowed, the plank replaced, the stone set back on top. The camels, heavier now with water, rose with a little more reluctance than before, but they rose, and the column formed up again in the same order, and you took your place at the rear, your staff in your hand, and your shadow waiting patiently beside you on the moonlit sand. The well and its small circle of stones had fallen far behind, swallowed by the darkness as completely as if it had never been there, and the caravan moved now through a landscape that felt deeper and more remote with every step. The moon was well above the dunes now, high enough that it threw sharp silver light onto the crests and left the troughs in a darkness that was soft rather than deep, a darkness filled with the faint glow of reflected light from the pale sand. You walked near the rear of the column, sometimes a pace behind the last camel, sometimes beside it, and the sand under your feet was fine and cool, sliding away with a dry whisper each time you lifted your heel. The air had grown noticeably cooler since the well, and you pulled your outer robe more closely around your shoulders, tucking the loose end under your belt so that it would not flap in the small, steady breeze that had begun to stir from the north. That breeze carried a smell that was clean and empty, like old paper left in the sun, and it pressed lightly against the side of your face without ever growing stronger, a constant presence that you noticed only when you thought about it. The guide, walking far ahead at the head of the line, had begun to hum again, the same 3 notes repeating over and over in a pattern that had no real beginning or end. You could barely hear it, but you felt it as a low vibration in the air, something that mixed with the soft huff of the camels and the muted chime of the brass bell that hung from the lead animal's neck. That bell rang with every step the camel took, a thin, clear note that lasted only a moment before the sand absorbed it, and the rhythm of it had become so familiar that you no longer noticed when it chimed, only when it paused for a single missed step and then resumed. The camels moved with their heads low and their eyes half closed, their broad feet pressing deep prints into the sand that filled slowly with the sliding grains after they passed. Now and then, one of the animals shook its head, and the loose skin of its throat flapped with a soft, slapping sound, or it let out a long, rumbling breath that fluttered its nostrils and sent a small puff of dust into the moonlit air. You had been walking for a time that you did not try to measure, letting the steps count themselves in your mind, and then fade before you reached any number that meant anything. The moon cast your shadow long and thin to your left, stretching across the rippled sand and bending over the small curved shapes of the dunes that rose and fell in every direction. Sometimes the shadow of the camel beside you overlapped your own, and the two dark shapes merged into a single broad patch that moved with a strange, jointed motion, as if some larger creature were walking there in your place. The sand ahead was covered with the same faint, wispy ripple marks that you had seen earlier in the night, all running in the same direction so regular that they looked like the grain of a piece of old wood, and you noticed how your footsteps disturbed them only for a moment before the loose grains settled back and the pattern closed over your passing. The column began to climb a long, wind-packed slope that lifted itself out of the trough and rose toward a high, curved crest that cut across the stars like a dark, smooth wave. The angle was gentle at first, so gradual that you hardly felt the extra pull in your legs. But as you walked higher, the sand grew firmer underfoot, and your heels left only shallow impressions that held their shape without crumbling. The guide's pace slowed by a small, almost imperceptible amount, and the camels adjusted without any signal, their bodies tilting forward into the climb with a patient, steady effort. You heard the drovers murmuring to them, the same soft words over and over: easy, now, good, stand and. One of the men reached up to pat the flank of the animal in front of him, his hand making a dull, rhythmic sound against the coarse hair. The bell rang a little more slowly now, each note coming after a longer pause, and the guide's three-note hum seemed to stretch itself out to match the new rhythm, the notes floating out into the cool air and dissolving without echo. You found that your own breathing had settled into a pattern that matched the climb, each breath slow and deep and regular, and you noticed how the air tasted faintly of the dry mineral dust that the camel's feet kicked up. The moon was almost directly overhead now, and its light fell so straight that the camels cast only small dark circles directly beneath themselves, as if each animal was standing on a small pool of shadow. The world around you had taken on a strange, simplified look. Everything was either pale silver or deep charcoal, the dunes rolling away like a frozen sea that stretched to every horizon. You could see the faint cloudy band of the Milky Way arching across the sky, its light so thick and soft that it looked like a trail of fine sand blown across a dark floor, and the stars themselves were so many that the familiar constellations almost disappeared among the unnamed ones. You picked out the camel's hump, the trader's staff, the north well, and then you let your gaze drop back to the sand in front of you, where the small shifting grains were each catching a tiny point of moonlight. A little way ahead, the dune crest finally flattened out, and the guide led the column along a narrow ridge that ran for 100 paces before dipping into another long, shallow trough. The sand on the ridge was packed hard by the wind, and walking on it was almost like walking on a paved road, your footsteps making no sound at all for a while, until the surface changed again and the dry whisper returned. You noticed a single small stone lying on the sand, dark and round and perfectly smooth, and you bent to pick it up without stopping, turning it over in your fingers before letting it drop. The stone was cool and heavier than you expected, and it left a faint, clean smell on your palm that reminded you of the well water. The camel ahead of you turned its head and looked at you for a moment with its large, dark eyes, and then it faced forward again, and the two of you walked on together, the stone already forgotten behind you. The trough on the far side of the ridge was broader than any you had crossed so far, a wide, shallow basin filled with sand that was noticeably softer and finer than what you had been walking on. Your feet sank into it with each step, and the effort of walking increased just enough that you were aware of it, the gentle, steady burn in your calves that was not unpleasant. The camels fanned out slightly as they descended, no longer walking in a strict line, and their broad feet made deep, bowl-shaped prints that filled with shadow and looked like dark pools of water. The guide had stopped humming, and in the new quiet you could hear the sand shifting all around you. Not a loud sound, but a soft, continuous rustle, like the sound of a dry cloth being drawn slowly across a wooden table. It mixed with the chime of the bell, the creak of leather, and the faint distant whistle of the breeze as it moved over the dune crests high above. You found yourself thinking about the route the guide was following, a path that only he could see, marked by nothing more than the memory of old journeys and the silent map of the stars. The direction had changed several times since the well, small adjustments that you would not have noticed if you had not been watching your shadow shift against the sand, and you understood that the guide was steering the caravan through a series of invisible gates between the dunes, avoiding the tallest crests and the softest sand. It was the kind of knowledge that came only from walking the same routes year after year, and you trusted it without needing to understand it, just as the camels trusted the guide and the drovers trusted the camels. You let the thought drift away, and you watched the sand change color from pale silver to a slightly warmer gray as the moonlight shifted, and you counted your steps again until the numbers blurred and you forgot to keep going. After a long while, the guide raised his staff and let it fall, and the camels slowed to a halt in a place where the sand was level and firm and scattered with small dark pebbles. This was not a rest like the well stop. It was a brief pause to check the loads and let the animals settle, and the drovers moved quickly along the line, their hands touching each rope and knot with the same patient attention they had shown a dozen times already. You took a sip from your water skin, and the water was still cool from the well, with that faint mineral taste that made you want to drink more. You stood still while you drank, and you looked up at the sky, where the stars had wheeled a little further along their slow path, and you noticed that the moon had passed its highest point and was now just a little to the west. The night was exactly halfway through, though you had no way of knowing that, except by the feeling of the air and the angle of the light, and the thought passed through your mind without leaving any mark. The guide touched the lead camel's shoulder and murmured something, and the animal stepped forward, and the caravan began to move again, the pause sliding back into the deep silence of the desert without a ripple. You fell into step, and the rhythm of the walk reclaimed you, the steps, the breath, the bell, the whisper of sand. The moon continued its slow descent, and the shadows began to lengthen again, stretching out to the right now as the light came from the opposite side. You noticed that the sand in this part of the trough was marked with tiny, round depressions, each one no larger than your smallest fingernail, and you knew they were the tracks of a desert beetle that had passed this way hours before. You did not see the beetle, and you did not expect to. It was enough to see its tracks, and to know that something else had moved through the same stillness. The guide's three-note hum started up again, softer now, as if he were saving his voice, and the sound of it wrapped around you like the cool air, familiar and unremarkable, carrying you deeper into the sand sea with every quiet step. The moon lifted itself above the dark rim of the dunes behind you without any hurry, a pale silver-white disk just a little past full, its edge ever so slightly blurred where it had begun to wane. You did not turn your head to look at it directly. Instead, you became aware of the way your own shadow stretched across the sand in front of you, long and thin and moving with a soft, jointed motion that seemed to belong to someone slightly taller, slightly slower. It slid over the rippled surface like a quiet companion, bending where the sand rose and dipping where it fell, and you could see the shadow of your staff running out ahead of the shadow of your hand, a dark straight line that pointed always toward the unseen path ahead. The moonlight spilled across the dunes as if poured slowly from a bowl, catching the crests in bright silver and leaving the hollows filled with a soft, blue-tinged darkness that was never quite black. The world changed under that new light. Before the moonrise, you had been walking through a landscape drawn in shades of charcoal and deep grey, the stars providing only enough illumination to separate the darker bulk of the dunes from the slightly lighter sky. Now every curve and hollow stood out clearly, the faces of the dunes revealing their true shapes, their wind-sculpted contours picked out by the low-angled light. You could see the fine, parallel ripples that ran across the sand like the grain of old wood, each one a tiny ridge of darker sand catching a thread of silver along its crest. The camel's broad feet pressed into the surface with every step, leaving prints that held their form for a moment before crumbling at the edges, the loose grains sliding down to fill the shallow bowl of each impression. The print of a led camel was already fading by the time your own foot landed near it, and within a dozen paces there was nothing left but the same smooth, wind-touched surface you had been walking on all night. Your eyes adjusted to the monochrome landscape, and you found yourself walking with a steadier pace, your feet landing more surely now that you could read the small variations in the sand. The guide, walking far ahead at the head of the column, had changed direction slightly, bearing a little more to the left, and the whole caravan followed him in a slow, fluid curve that seemed to happen without any signal. You understood that he was navigating by something invisible to you, perhaps a line of harder sand, where the wind had packed the grains into a firm crust, or a gap between two tall crests that would have blocked the way if he had continued straight. The dunes on either side rose up like smooth, dark walls, their upper edges silver-bright against the star-thick sky, and the trough between them was broad enough that the column could walk many abreast, though the camels kept to their single file out of habit and training. There was no wind at ground level, no sound of insects or night birds, only the soft, steady chime of the brass bell, the regular huff of the camel's breathing, and the faint creak of leather straps that shifted with each step. You passed a wind-carved ridge where the sand had been shaped into delicate, overlapping scallops, each one a perfect crescent with a sharp, curled lip that caught the moonlight like a thin edge of polished metal. The shadows inside the scallops were deep and soft, and the pattern repeated itself all along the flank of the dune, so regular that it looked as if it had been made by a careful hand, rather than by the patient work of a steady wind. The camel in front of you turned its heavy head to one side and let out a long, fluttering breath that shook the loose skin of its throat, and then it faced forward again, and its broad foot landed directly on the edge of one of those perfect crescents, collapsing it into a scatter of loose sand that slid down the slope with a dry, rustling sound. You watched the slide settle into stillness, and then you walked on, and the scalloped ridge fell behind and was replaced by a new kind of surface, just as quiet and just as still. The guide had begun to hum again, the same three notes repeating in a low, tuneless pattern that seemed to float on the cool air without any source. You could feel the vibration of it more than you could hear it, a presence that was always there, weaving itself into the other sounds of the caravan until it became just another part of the night. The bell on the lead camel chimed once with each step, a thin, clear note that rose and fell, and the drovers spoke to the animals in low, murmured voices, the same short phrases repeated so often that they had lost all meaning and become pure sound. So good, easy, now easy, stand. One of the men, the young drover with the blue cloth tied around his upper arm, walked past you from the middle of the column to the front, carrying a small clay lamp with a single flame that flickered and leaned in the breeze of his own movement. He paused beside the guide, and the two of them exchanged a few quiet words that you could not hear, and then the drover walked back along the line, touching each camel on the shoulder as he passed, the lamplight catching the brass rings on the saddle frames and making them glow for a moment before the darkness closed over them again. You felt the weight of your staff in your right hand, the smooth acacia wood cool and familiar against your palm, and you noticed that the grain of the wood was just barely visible in the moonlight, a series of fine dark lines that ran the length of the shaft. You had cut this staff yourself from a tree that grew near the well at the northern edge of the gravel plain, a tree that had been old before you were born, and you had spent many evenings smoothing the wood with a flat stone until it fit your hand exactly. Now it was as much a part of your walking as your own legs, and you used it to test the firmness of the sand ahead when the light made a surface hard to read, tapping it lightly once, and then stepping forward with the same rhythm you had been using all night. The tip of the staff left small, round depressions in the sand, each one a perfect circle of shadow that lasted for a few paces before the loose grains slid back and erased it. The column began a long, gentle descent into a broad trough between two parallel dune ranges, and the angle of the ground changed so gradually that you hardly noticed the shift in your own posture until you felt your heels pressing a little deeper into the sand. The dunes on either side were taller here than any you had passed so far, their crests high above you and their flanks steep and smooth, and they funneled the moonlight down into the trough so that the whole space was filled with a silver glow that seemed almost solid. You could see the camels ahead of you with perfect clarity, their loads of bundled cloth and clay jars and leather sacks casting deep, blocky shadows on the sand, and you could see the drovers walking beside them, their robes the color of the sand itself, their faces hidden by their own headscarves. The guide's figure was a small dark shape far ahead, his staff rising and falling with each step, his robe blending into the shadows at the base of the dune so that he seemed to appear and disappear as he passed through patches of deeper darkness. The moon climbed higher, and the world became a study in still silver and deep charcoal, a place of absolute quiet that held nothing but the caravan and the sand, and the slow, steady progress of the night. You found yourself thinking about the way the moon had looked when it first rose, a huge pale orange disk sitting on the horizon like a heavy coin, and how it had changed as it climbed, losing its color and shrinking to the cool white circle it was now. The guide had told you once, on another journey, that the moon followed a different path across the sky every night, and that you could read the season by its rising point and the height of its arc, just as you could read the desert by the shape of the dunes and the direction of the wind ripples. You did not need to know these things for your work. Your task was simply to walk at the rear of the column and keep your eyes open, but the knowledge had settled into your mind over the years, and now you noticed the moon's position without consciously checking it, as naturally as you noticed the warmth of the camel beside you, or the coolness of the air on your face. The drover with the blue cloth walked past you again, this time moving from the front to the rear, and he nodded once as he passed, a small, silent acknowledgement that everything was as it should be. You nodded back and he continued on, his footsteps making soft, crunching sounds on the scattered pebbles that lay in the bottom of the trough. These pebbles were smooth and dark, polished by centuries of wind-blown sand, and they glowed faintly in the moonlight like a scattered handful of dark pearls. Some of them were round, and some were flat, and they lay half buried in the sand so that only their upper surfaces caught the light. You stepped over a particularly large one, a flat oval stone that looked like a small dark plate, and you wondered without any real curiosity how far it had traveled to end up in this particular trough between these particular dunes. The thought drifted away without settling, and you walked on, your sandal brushing the pebble's edge with a faint, gritty sound. The air had grown cooler still, and you noticed that your breath now formed a faint, brief mist in front of your face, appearing and disappearing so quickly that you were never quite sure you had seen it. The breeze from the north had strengthened just enough to make the loose end of your headscarf stir against your cheek, a soft, intermittent touch that was almost like a finger brushing your skin. You tucked the cloth more securely, and you pulled your outer robe tighter around your shoulders, and you settled back into the rhythm of the walk, the steps, the breath, the bell, the creak, the hum. The camels moved with their heads low, their long eyelashes casting tiny, moving shadows on their cheeks, and one of them coughed once, a deep, guttural sound that echoed briefly between the dune walls before the silence absorbed it. The sand underfoot was still soft, but not too soft, the kind that gave just enough to make walking a deliberate, gentle effort, and you felt the muscles in your legs working with a steady, pleasant warmth that spread upward and outward until it filled your whole body. The guide led the column around a sharp bend in the trough, and for a moment the moon was hidden behind the high dune to your right, plunging the path into a sudden darkness that made the stars overhead seem twice as bright. You looked up and saw the Milky Way arcing across the sky, its cloudy band of light thick and soft, and you could pick out the dark patches within it that the guide called the openings places, where, he said, the sky had worn thin, and you could almost see through to whatever lay beyond. You did not know if that was true, but the image stayed with you, and you found yourself looking for the dark patches as you walked, finding one and then another, and then losing them again as the moon re-emerged and washed the sky with silver. The bell chimed, the camel ahead of you shook its head so that its brass harness rings clinked together, and the guide's hum continued, 3 notes rising and falling in an endless, gentle loop. You came to a place where the sand was marked with a line of small, precise tracks, each one a delicate print of tiny feet with a thin, dragging tail mark between them. You recognized them as the tracks of a desert lizard, a creature that you had seen only a few times, usually in the early morning when it came out to warm itself on a sun-heated stone. The tracks led off to the left, angling up the flank of the dune, and you followed them with your eyes until they disappeared into the shadow of a wind-carved overhang. The lizard itself was nowhere to be seen, and you did not expect it to be. It was tucked into some crevice, waiting out the cool hours until the sun returned. You passed the tracks, and they were gone, and the sand ahead was smooth and unmarked again, ready to receive the caravan's passing and then forget it. The trough began to widen, the dune walls on either side losing height as they sloped away into a broader, flatter basin, and the sand underfoot changed from fine and soft to a coarser, grittier texture that crunched faintly under your soles. The guide's pace remained steady, and the camels adjusted to the new surface without any sign of discomfort, their broad feet spreading to take their weight on the looser grains. You noticed that the shadows had grown noticeably longer again, stretching out to your right now as the moon continued its slow descent toward the western horizon, and your shadow walked beside you, a dark, silent companion that mimicked your every movement with perfect, unthinking fidelity. The shadow of the camel ahead of you was a huge, bulging shape that rippled over the uneven ground, and the shadow of your staff was a thin, sharp line that cut across everything in its path. You drank from your water skin, pulling the wooden stopper and letting a few mouthfuls of the cool, mineral-tasting water slide slowly down your throat. The leather of the skin was smooth and dark from years of handling, and it had a faint, pleasant smell that mixed with the dry, clean scent of the desert air. You corked the skin and hung it back across your body, and you walked on, feeling the water settle in your stomach with a small, cool weight. The night stretched out ahead of you as quiet and endless as the sand itself, and you followed the caravan into it, one step after another, under the climbing moon that turned the world to still silver and deep charcoal. You had been walking for a long, unmeasured stretch of time, and the rhythm of it had become so steady that your body had forgotten it was doing anything at all when the guide stopped beside a patch of flat, firm sand and raised one hand without turning around. The movement was small and unhurried, the hand lifting just high enough to be seen against the dark shape of the dune beyond it, and then it dropped back to his side as if it had never moved. The camels halted in place, not all at once, but in a slow, rippling wave that started at the front of the column and passed backward, each animal stopping when the one ahead of it stopped, until the last camel came to a standstill, a few paces in front of you. Some of the camels made low, rumbling sounds deep in their throats, sounds that were not quite growls and not quite groans, and a few of them shook their heads so that the loose skin of their necks flapped softly. The brass bell on the lead camel rang once more, a single thin note that hung in the still air for a moment and then faded, and after that there was a deep, settling quiet. You took this pause as your cue to drink, and you pulled the wooden stopper from your water skin with a small dry pop. The water inside was no longer cool, having warmed to the temperature of the air during the long walk, and when you let a few mouthfuls run slowly over your tongue, it tasted faintly of the leather bag, a taste that was not unpleasant, but was simply part of traveling. You swallowed in small, deliberate sips, feeling the liquid move down your throat and settle in your stomach with a small, warm weight. And you let the last mouthful rest in your mouth for a moment, before swallowing, just to feel the moisture against your dry lips. The skin itself was dark and smooth from years of handling, its surface worn to a soft sheen where your hands had gripped it, and the wooden stopper was carved from a piece of the same acacia wood as your staff, fitted so well that it made a perfect seal. You stood still while you drank, your staff planted in the sand beside you, and you watched the drovers move quietly forward along the line to check the loads. The drovers walked with the same patient, unhurried pace they had used all night, their sandaled feet making soft, crunching sounds on the firm sand. They touched each rope and knot with careful fingers, giving a small tug here, a slight adjustment there, murmuring the same quiet words to the camels that they always murmured, "Good, now easy, stand," and the animals stood with their heads low and their eyes half closed, accepting the attention without any reaction. The young drover with the blue cloth tied around his upper arm stopped beside the camel just ahead of you and ran his hand along the girth strap, feeling the tension of the woven wool, and then he patted the animal on the shoulder with a rhythmic, muffled thump that sounded like a soft drum. The camel turned its head slightly and blew a long, fluttering breath through its nostrils, and the drover smiled without showing his teeth and walked on to the next animal. The older drover, the broad one who had been with the guide for as long as anyone could remember, walked all the way to the rear of the column and stood for a moment looking back the way you had come, his hands resting on his hips, his face hidden by his headscarf. He saw nothing, or nothing that concerned him, and after a short while he turned and walked forward again, his footsteps leaving a line of deep, even prints in the sand. You caught the water skin and hung it back across your body, adjusting the strap so that it lay flat against your hip without chafing, and you began to walk a slow, wide circle around the rear of the column. Your staff made small, round depressions in the sand with each step, the tip pressing down and then lifting, leaving a neat hole that filled almost immediately with the fine grains sliding back from the edges. The air was dry and cool, not cold, and it carried the faint, sharp scent of the crushed herbs that the drovers tucked into the saddle pants to keep insects away, a smell that was clean and earthy, like dried lavender mixed with something greener, something that reminded you of the small, scrubby plants that grew near the wells. That smell had been with the caravan all night, but you only noticed it now because you were standing still, and it mixed with the older, deeper smells of camel hair and lamp oil and the warm, dusty scent of the sand itself. The sand in this place was firm and fine, packed smooth by a wind that had blown days ago, and your footprints were shallow and crisp, as clear as if they had been pressed into damp clay. You completed your circle and stopped at the edge of the small flat patch where the caravan had halted, looking out at the dunes that rolled away in every direction. The moon was still high and bright, though it had moved a little further to the west since you had last checked its position, and its light fell on the sand with a soft, even glow that made the world look like a vast, still ocean frozen in place. The crests of the nearest dunes were sharp and silver-edged, their shadows deep and blue-black, and the troughs between them were filled with a softer darkness that you could see into if you let your eyes adjust. Nothing moved anywhere, not a flicker of shadow, not a stirring of dust, and the only signs of life in the whole visible world were the caravan behind you and the long, fading track of footprints that stretched back across the sand until it curved around a dune and disappeared. You stood there for a while, your staff held loosely in both hands, and you let your gaze wander from dune to dune, finding nothing, expecting nothing, and feeling the quiet settle deeper into your bones with every slow breath. The sky overhead was crowded with stars, so many that the spaces between them seemed almost as bright as the stars themselves, and the faint, cloudy band of the Milky Way arched across the sky from south to north, like a trail of fine sand blown across a dark floor. You tilted your head back and let your eyes trace the familiar patterns, picking out the constellations that the guide used to navigate, the same ones you had learned on your first journey with him many years ago. There was the camel's hump, a broad curve of 3 bright stars with a fainter 4th at its center. There was the trader's staff, a straight line of 5 stars that pointed almost exactly toward the northern horizon. And there was the north well, a tight, dim cluster that was easy to miss unless you knew exactly where to look. You found each one in turn, your gaze moving from star to star with a slow, practiced ease. And you thought about how many nights you had spent under this same sky, walking behind these same camels, following this same guide. The thought did not stir any strong feeling, only a quiet, comfortable familiarity, like recognizing the grain of your own staff or the taste of the water from your own skin. The guide had walked a little apart from the column, as he always did during these pauses, and he stood now on a low rise of sand with his back to the caravan, looking up at the stars with his head tilted back and his staff planted firmly beside him. His robe, a faded wool garment the color of dry earth, blended so perfectly with the sand that he seemed to be a part of the landscape, a natural feature that had always been there and would always be there. You did not go to speak with him, because there was nothing to say, and you knew that he was doing exactly what you had just been doing, checking the stars against the internal map that he carried in his mind, a map laid down over decades of walking and never written down. After a short while he lowered his head and looked out toward the darker dunes on the far side of the basin, his gaze moving slowly from left to right, and then he turned and walked back toward the caravan with the same measured stride he used for everything. He did not raise his hand or speak a word. He simply walked past the lead camel and continued on, and the camel lifted its head and stepped forward, and the whole column began to move again as naturally as water flowing downhill. You fell into your place at the rear of the line, and the pause slipped back into the deep silence of the night without leaving any ripple, as if it had never happened at all. The camels walked with the same slow, steady gait, their broad feet pressing prints into the sand that held their shape for a moment before crumbling, and the bell on the lead camel began to chime again with every step. Your staff found its rhythm against the sand, tapping once with each stride, and your breathing settled back into the slow, easy pattern that matched the pace of the walk. The guide had started humming again, the three notes floating out into the cool air, and the sound of it wrapped around you like a familiar blanket. You noticed that the sand underfoot had changed slightly since the rest stop, becoming a little finer and a little softer, so that your feet sank into it just enough to make each step feel deliberate and calm, and you adjusted your stride without thinking about it, the way you had adjusted it 1,000 times before. The moon continued its slow descent toward the western horizon, and the shadows of the camels lengthened again, stretching out to the right and moving across the sand like dark, silent companions. You watched your own shadow walk beside you, its long legs taking long strides, its thin arms swinging the shadow of your staff, and you noticed how it bent and rippled when it passed over a small ridge or a patch of uneven ground. The shadow of the camel ahead of you was a huge, bulging shape that seemed to breathe with a life of its own, expanding and contracting as the animal shifted its weight from foot to foot. The night had grown noticeably cooler, and you pulled your outer robe a little tighter around your shoulders, tucking the loose end under your arm so that it would not flap in the small, steady breeze. That breeze still came from the north, carrying the same clean, empty smell, and it pressed lightly against the side of your face with a coolness that was almost, but not quite, cold. You passed a patch of sand that was covered with tiny dark seeds, each one no larger than a grain of rice, scattered in a loose, irregular line that curved away toward the base of a nearby dune. You knew that these seeds came from a desert plant that grew in the troughs between the dunes, a tough, wiry shrub with small, silvery leaves that you had seen only a few times, usually near a well or a seep. The seeds had been dropped here by the wind, or perhaps by a passing bird, and they lay on the surface of the sand as if waiting for a rain that might not come for years. You stepped over the line of seeds, careful not to disturb them, even though you knew the wind would scatter them soon enough, and you walked on, leaving them behind in the moonlight. The camel ahead of you turned its head and looked at you, with its large, dark eyes, and then it faced forward again, and the two of you walked on together, the seeds already forgotten. The trough you had been walking in began to narrow again, the dunes on either side drawing closer until they were no more than 100 paces apart, and the sand underfoot grew firmer and more compacted. The guide's pace remained steady, and the camels adjusted to the changing surface without any sign of discomfort, their broad feet spreading to take their weight on the harder ground. You could hear the drovers speaking to each other now and then, a few low words that carried no meaning at this distance, just a soft murmur that rose and fell and disappeared. The older drover walked back from the front of the column and stopped beside you for a moment, his face still hidden by his headscarf, and he nodded once, a small, silent gesture that meant all was well, and then he turned and walked forward again. You nodded back, though he was already gone, and you continued walking, your staff tapping the firm sand with a soft, steady thump. The sky in the east had begun to show a very faint lightning, so subtle that you could not be sure it was really there, a deep, dark blue that held no stars at its lowest edge. The guide had noticed it too. You could tell by the way he tilted his head slightly to the left every few minutes, checking the horizon, measuring the progress of the night. The moon was still bright overhead, but you knew that it would set soon, dropping below the western dunes and leaving the caravan to walk by starlight alone for a while before the dawn. You had made this transition many times before, and you knew that the hour before moonset was the quietest part of the night. the time when the camels were sleepiest, and the drovers spoke least, and the guide's hum dropped to a whisper that was barely there. You settled into the walk and let the time pass, your thoughts becoming slow and simple, your steps falling one after another like the slow, steady beat of a distant drum. At some point, you became aware that the guide had stopped humming, and the absence of the three notes was as noticeable as the sound. The bell on the lead camel rang once, twice, 3 times, and then the camels slowed and stopped, not a full halt like the rest stop, but a brief, gentle pause while the guide stood still and looked up at the sky. You stopped with them, your staff resting on the sand, and you looked up too, wondering what he had seen. The stars were still thick and bright, the Milky Way still arching overhead, but now you noticed that one of the brighter stars near the western horizon was flickering, its light pulsing softly, as if it were breathing. The guide watched it for a long moment, and then he nodded to himself and resumed his pace, and the caravan moved on, the brief pause dissolving as if it had never been. You did not know what the flickering star meant, and you did not need to know. You trusted the guide's judgment, the way the camels trusted the drovers, and you walked on, your staff tapping the sand, your breath slow and even, the night wrapped around you like a thick, quiet cloak. You walked now in the bottom of the trough between 2 great dune ridges, a broad, flat-bottomed corridor that ran straight for as far as you could see before curving gently out of sight around a dark, massive shoulder of sand. The dunes on either side rose up like the high, smooth walls of a quiet street, their flanks steep and shadowed, their crests silver-edged, where the moonlight struck them from almost directly overhead. That light fell so straight that the camels cast only small dark circles beneath themselves, as if each animal was standing on a shallow pool of shadow that moved with it step by step, never growing larger or smaller. The sand underfoot was firmer here than it had been in the softer troughs you crossed earlier in the night, compacted by some old wind into a surface that took your weight without giving way, and scattered across it were small, smooth pebbles that glowed like tiny moons under the high, pale light. Some of those pebbles were round and dark, polished to a dull sheen, while others were flat and pale, almost white, and they lay half buried in the sand so that only their upper surfaces caught the light and threw it back in small, steady points. Your footsteps made a soft, crunching sound as you walked over them, a sound like dry cereal being pressed under a thumb, and you could hear the camels' broad feet doing the same ahead of you, a rhythmic, gentle grinding that mixed with the chime of the bell and the steady huff of their breathing. Your thoughts had become very slow and simple, matching the rhythm of your steps so completely that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. You counted your footsteps without meaning to, reaching 30 or 40 before the numbers dissolved and began again, and sometimes you counted the chimes of the bell instead, or the soft thumps of your staff against the sand, and the numbers never added up to anything because you never tried to make them add up. The guide's 3-note hum continued far ahead, a quiet, tuneless sound that you felt more than heard, and it had been part of the night for so long that it had become something like the pulse of your own blood, always there and never noticed until you stopped to notice it. One of the camels in the middle of the line exhaled a long, fluttering breath that shook the loose skin of its soft palate, making a sound like a thick cloth being shaken once and then stilled, and the quiet swallowed it so quickly that a moment later you could not be sure you had heard it at all. The camel shook its head, the brass rings on its harness clinking together with a series of small bright notes, and then it was still again, walking on with the same patient, heavy stride. You noticed that the sand in this part of the trough was covered with very faint, wispy ripple marks, no larger than your little finger, and they all ran in the same direction across the floor of the corridor, recording a wind that had blown days or weeks ago and not returned. The ripples were so shallow that your footsteps erased them without effort, pressing a smooth, flat print into the patterned surface, and you looked back once to see the line of prints stretching away behind you, each one a small dark interruption in the silver-grey field of ripples. The prints would fade by morning, filled in by the next breeze, or simply by the slow, patient work of the sand settling back into itself, and you turned forward again without any feeling of loss, because the desert always erased what passed over it, and that was simply the way of things. The guide's hum rose and fell, the three notes looping around and around, and the pebbles crunched underfoot, and the camel ahead of you flicked its tail once, a slow, lazy motion that stirred the air without making a sound. The dune walls on either side began to lose height so gradually that you did not notice the change at first, only becoming aware after a long while that the shadows beside you were not as deep as they had been, and the silver crests above were closer to the level of your own head. The trough was widening as it rose, the corridor opening out into a broader, shallower basin where the sand was no longer hemmed in by steep slopes, but rolled away in low, lazy undulations that stretched toward every horizon. The guide adjusted his bearing slightly, turning a few degrees to the left, and the caravan followed him in a slow, smooth curve that seemed to happen without any signal, as if the camels knew the route as well as he did. You found yourself walking on a surface that was almost flat, the pebbles becoming fewer and farther apart, and the sand underfoot returned to a fine soft texture that gave slightly with each step and released a dry, whispering sound. The moon was still nearly straight overhead, but you could tell by the faint, cool smell in the air that the deepest part of the night had arrived, the hour when the desert held its breath and the stars seemed to press down a little closer to the earth. The young drover with the blue cloth tied around his upper arm walked past you again, moving from the front of the column toward the rear, and this time he carried no lamp, only a small coil of spare rope that he turned over and over in his hands as he walked. He paused beside you for a moment, falling into step with your own pace, and you walked together in silence for a dozen strides before he spoke in a low, quiet voice that was barely louder than the sand itself. He said that the guide had seen a patch of softer sand ahead where the animals might slow for a while, and that you should watch your footing when you reached it, but not be concerned. You nodded, and he walked on toward the rear, and soon you heard him speaking in the same low voice to the drover at the very back of the column, his words too quiet to catch. The camel in front of you turned its heavy head and looked at you with one dark, calm eye, and then it faced forward again, and the two of you walked on, the message already absorbed and filed away with all the other small pieces of information that made up a night's travel. The softer sand arrived after a time that could have been half an hour or could have been an hour and a half, and you recognized it by the way your feet sank a little deeper, the fine grains sliding up around your ankles and filling the gaps between your sandal straps. The camels adjusted their gait without any signal, taking shorter, more deliberate steps, and their broad feet spread wide to keep them from sinking too far. The bell on the lead camel chimed with a slightly slower rhythm now, each note separated by a longer pause, and the guide's humming slowed to match, the three notes stretching out until they were almost separate sounds rather than a continuous thread. Walking through the soft sand required a slightly more deliberate motion, lifting each foot just a little higher and placing it just a little more carefully, and you settled into the new rhythm quickly, your muscles accepting the extra effort without complaint. Your breath remained slow and even, and you noticed that the air had become just cool enough that your breath formed a faint, brief mist in front of your face, there, and gone so quickly that you were never quite sure you had seen it. The basin you had entered was broad and open, its edges lost in the darkness, and the sky above it seemed larger than it had in the narrow troughs, a vast, dark dome, thick with stars from one horizon to the other. The Milky Way arced across the zenith, its cloudy band of light so bright that it cast a faint, diffuse glow on the sand, and you could see the dark patches within it that the guide called the openings, the places where the sky wore thin. You found one of those patches and watched it for a while as you walked, a small dark shape that did not move and did not change, and you let your gaze drift from it to another and then another, your eyes moving slowly across the sky while your feet moved steadily across the sand. The guide's three-note hum was so quiet now that you could barely hear it, a whisper of sound that might have been the wind or might have been your own imagination, and the camels walked with their heads low and their eyes half closed, breathing slowly and steadily in the deep, still cold. You passed a single dead thorn bush that stood half buried in the sand near the center of the basin, its bare branches bleached white by the sun and scoured smooth by the wind. It appeared so suddenly in the gloom that for a single step you almost thought it was an animal, a crouching shape that should not have been there, but your mind corrected itself before the thought could fully form, and you walked past it without pausing. The bush was old and dry, its roots probably reaching down to some deep, forgotten moisture that had not existed for decades, and its branches curled and twisted in shapes that seemed almost deliberate. You glanced at it as you passed, and then it was behind you, swallowed by the darkness, and the sand ahead was empty again, smooth and unmarked and waiting. The guide's pace did not change, and the caravan continued across the basin with the same slow, steady progress that it had maintained all night, a progress that felt less like movement and more like a kind of stillness in which the landscape itself shifted around you. The dunes on the far side of the basin were visible now as a low, dark line against the slightly lighter sky, and you could see that they were much lower than the ones you had crossed earlier, mere hills rather than mountains of sand. The moon had finally begun its last descent toward the western horizon, and its light came at a shallow angle that made the sand look rougher and more textured, every small irregularity thrown into sharp relief. Your shadow stretched far out to your left now, impossibly long, sometimes climbing up the flank of a low, rolling undulation and then sliding down the other side as if it were on its own separate journey. The shadow of the camel ahead of you was a huge, distorted shape that bulged and rippled, its legs stretching into thin, jointed lines that looked like the legs of some giant, slow-moving insect. You drank from your water skin again, the water now fully warmed to the temperature of the air, tasting of leather and the faint clean memory of the well, and you let it sit in your mouth for a moment before swallowing. The act of drinking was so familiar that you did it without breaking stride, your hand finding the stopper, pulling it, lifting the skin, drinking, corking it again, all in a smooth, practiced sequence that required no thought at all. The skin hung back against your hip with a small, soft thump, and you wiped your mouth with the back of your hand, feeling the dry, cool air immediately begin to pull the moisture from your lips. The drover at the front of the column coughed once, a soft, muffled sound that was quickly swallowed by the silence, and then he murmured something to the camel beside him, the words too quiet to make out, but the tone calm and reassuring. The sky in the east had begun to show a very faint lightening, a deep dark blue that held no stars at its lowest edge, so subtle that you could not be sure it was really there. The guide had noticed it too. You could tell by the way he tilted his head slightly every few minutes, checking the horizon, measuring the progress of the night against whatever internal clock he carried. You had made this transition from deep night to the first hint of dawn many times before, and you knew that the coldest part of the night was just ahead, the hour when the sand gave up the last of its stored warmth and the air seemed to sharpen against your skin. You pulled your outer robe a little tighter, tucking the loose end under your belt, and you walked on, your staff tapping the sand with a soft, steady rhythm that matched the chime of the bell and the slow, even beat of your own heart. The pebbles had returned, scattered more thinly this time, and they crunched underfoot with a sound like distant, tiny thunder, a sound that came and went as the sand alternated between coarse and fine. The guide's humming stopped altogether, and for a long while the only sounds were the bell, the breath, the footfalls, and the faint, distant whistle of the breeze as it moved high above the dunes. The silence felt deep and complete, a silence that was not empty but filled with the quiet presence of the sand and the sky and the animals and the people, all moving together through the same dark, open space. You did not try to fill it with thoughts. You let it be, and you let your steps carry you forward, and you noticed how the first pale hint of dawn in the east had grown just a little brighter, just a little wider, a smooth, pearl-grey band that pushed upward against the blackness as if it were being slowly poured into the sky. The camel in front of you shook its head so that its brass rings clinked, and the sound was like a small, bright star falling into the quiet. The guide raised his head, looked toward the eastern horizon for a long moment, and then resumed his pace, and the caravan walked on into the last, deepest hour of the night. The caravan continued across the broad, open basin, while the moon dropped lower in the west, and the first pale hint of dawn in the east grew from a faint suggestion into a thin, definite line. You had been walking for a long while through sand that was fine and soft, then through sand that was coarse and scattered with pebbles, and now the ground underfoot was changing again, becoming harder and more level with every step. The dunes on either side had dwindled to low, rolling hills that barely deserved the name, and ahead of you the plain opened out into a vast, dark expanse that seemed to stretch all the way to the horizon. The stars were still bright overhead, though the faintest of them were beginning to fade near the eastern sky, and the air had grown cold enough that you could feel it on the tips of your ears and the backs of your hands. You pulled your headscarf a little lower and tucked your hands into the loose sleeves of your robe, and you walked on, your staff tapping the hardening ground with a sound that had changed from a soft whisper to a firmer, cleaner thump. The guide, walking far ahead at his usual pace, had not altered his pace all night, except for the brief pauses that came at regular intervals, and he did not alter it now. His figure was a small, dark shape against the slightly lighter sand, his robe blending into the landscape so completely that he seemed to flicker in and out of visibility as he passed through patches of deeper shadow. The camels followed him with the same patient, heavy steps they had used since the first dune, their loads swaying gently with each stride, and the brass bell on the lead animal rang with a thin, clear note that carried a little further in the open plain than it had in the narrow troughs. The drovers walked beside their animals, their heads low and their shoulders hunched slightly against the cool air, and the young one with the blue cloth around his arm had pulled a second scarf over his head so that only his eyes were visible. No one spoke, and the silence was deep and complete, broken only by the bell, the breath, the soft crunch of sand underfoot, and the very distant, very faint whistle of the breeze as it moved across the open plain without obstruction. At the lowest point of one of the gentle rolling undulations that crossed the plain, you saw a small circle of rough stones set into the ground, and you knew at once what it was. The well was not large or impressive. It was a simple, ancient shaft lined with fitted rock, its mouth no wider than the span of your arms, and it was covered by a heavy wooden plank with a large flat stone placed on top to hold it in place. A few smaller stones were scattered around the edge, some of them half buried in the sand, and the whole structure looked as if it had been there for a very long time, built by hands that had long since returned to the earth. The guide stopped beside the well, and the camels halted behind him in their usual slow, rippling wave, and the drovers moved forward at once, their quiet efficiency showing that this was a familiar stop on a familiar route. The older drover, the broad one, bent and lifted the flat stone from the plank with a low grunt, setting it aside on the sand, and then he and the young drover together slid the heavy wooden plank away from the well's mouth. The sound of the wood scraping against stone was rough and loud in the stillness, a brief, coarse noise that seemed almost out of place after so many hours of soft, muffled sounds. The well shaft was dark and deep, and a faint cool smell rose from it, the smell of deep earth and old stone and water that had been filtering through the rock for centuries. One of the drovers lowered a leather bucket on a long, coiled rope, and you could hear the bucket descending with a series of soft, echoing thumps as it brushed against the stone walls of the shaft. After a long pause there was a distant, liquid splash, and then the rope grew taut, and the drovers began to haul it up hand over hand, their breath coming in slow, steady puffs of mist. The bucket emerged from the darkness dripping and cold, its leather sides dark with moisture, and the water inside was so clear that it seemed almost invisible, catching the starlight and the last of the moonlight in trembling silver rings. The drovers poured the water into a series of shallow wooden troughs that they had unloaded from one of the camels, and the animals moved forward one by one to drink, their large dark eyes reflecting the pale light as they lowered their heads. They drank with slow, deliberate sips, their lower lips curling back to reveal their blunt, yellow teeth, and the water made a quiet, lapping sound that was unlike any other sound in the desert, a sound that spoke of life and patience and the long, slow passage of time. You watched the camels drink, and you felt your own thirst sharpen, but you waited where you were, knowing that the animals came first and that there would be water for you when they were finished. The guide stood a little apart from the well, as he always did, his staff planted in the sand, and his face turned toward the eastern horizon, where the pearl-grey band had grown a little wider and a little brighter. He did not look at the well, or at the camels, or at you. He looked only at the sky, his expression calm and unsurprising, as if the dawn were an old friend whose arrival he had been expecting for hours. When the camels had drunk their fill and been led back to their places in the line, the young drover dipped a clay jug into the bucket and brought it to you, holding it out with both hands. You took the jug, and you nodded your thanks, and the drover nodded back and turned away to attend to the other tasks. The water in the jug was cool, much cooler than the water in your skin, and it tasted faintly of minerals and deep earth, a clean, sharp taste that made you want to drink more than you needed. You drank slowly, letting each mouthful rest on your tongue for a moment before swallowing, and you felt the coolness spread down your throat and into your chest, and then into your stomach, where it settled with a small, pleasant weight. You refilled your water skin from the jug, the fresh, cool water mixing with the warmer, leather-tasting water that was still inside, and then you corked the skin and hung it back across your body, the strap settling into its familiar place against your hip. The older drover had spread a small rug on the sand near the well, and he gestured toward it with a tilt of his head, an invitation that was also not quite an invitation, because you were all part of the same caravan, and what belonged to one belonged to one. You sat down on the rug, your staff resting across your knees, and you took from your belt pouch a small handful of dried dates and a piece of hard flatbread that you had wrapped in a clean cloth. The dates were dark and sticky, their skins wrinkled and tough, and they tasted intensely sweet, a sweetness that seemed to fill your whole mouth and linger on your tongue long after you had swallowed. The bread was dry and bland, made from coarse flour and water and nothing else, and it crumbled slightly as you chewed, absorbing the sweetness of the dates and turning it into something more substantial. You ate slowly, without hurry, and you watched the drovers as they moved around the well, coiling the rope, checking the bucket for wear, murmuring to each other in voices that were too quiet to hear. The camels stood patiently in their line, their heads low and their eyes half closed, their bodies steaming slightly in the cold air as the warmth of their breath condensed into small drifting clouds. The guide did not sit down with you. He walked a slow, wide circle around the well, his staff tapping the ground with a soft, regular rhythm, and he stopped at several points to look out toward the horizon in different directions, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something far away. You knew that he was checking the landmarks that only he could see, the invisible signs that told him exactly where he was and exactly how far remained to be traveled. After a while he came and stood near the rug, and you offered him a piece of bread without speaking, holding it out in your open palm. He took it with a small nod, broke off a corner, and chewed it slowly while he continued to look toward the east. The bread was the same as it had been a moment before, dry and bland, but the guide ate it as if it were exactly what he had wanted, and when he was finished he brushed the crumbs from his robe and walked back to the head of the column. You sat on the rug for a little while longer, letting the food settle and the water do its quiet work inside you. The sky in the east had continued to lighten, and now the pearl-grey band had become a smooth, pale ribbon that stretched across the entire horizon, its upper edge fading into a deep, dark blue that still held a handful of the brightest stars. The moon was very low in the west, just a thin, pale sliver above the dark line of the dunes you had crossed, and its light was so faint now that it barely cast a shadow. The air was at its coldest, the kind of cold that felt clean and sharp against your skin, and you pulled your robe tighter and tucked your hands into your sleeves, feeling the warmth of your own body trapped in the layers of wool. You looked up at the sky and found the last few stars you knew, the trader's staff and the north well, and you watched them fade one by one as the dawn crept upward, erasing them as gently as a hand wiping a dusty table. When you rose from the rug, the older drover came and rolled it up with a few quick, practiced motions, tucking it back into its place on one of the pack saddles. The bucket had been stowed, the plank replaced over the well's mouth, the flat stone set back on top, and the troughs had been emptied and turned upside down to dry. The well looked exactly as it had when you arrived, a small, ancient circle of stones in the middle of a vast, empty plain, and you knew that it would remain there, unchanged, until the next caravan passed this way and the next drovers lifted the plank and drew up the cool, deep water. The camels were heavier now, their stomachs full and their bodies rehydrated, and they stood with a little more reluctance than before, as if they would have preferred to stay here beside the well for the rest of the night and into the day. But they were trained animals, patient and obedient, and when the guide lifted his staff and let it fall, they stirred themselves and began to walk, their broad feet pressing deep prints into the sand that would last until the next wind erased them. You took your place at the rear of the column, and the caravan moved away from the well, leaving it behind in the darkness with the same quiet, unhurried pace that had marked every part of the journey. The ground underfoot was firm and level, scattered with small dark pebbles that crunched softly with each step, and the dunes were now far behind you, reduced to a low dark smudge on the western horizon that was quickly fading from sight. The sky ahead was brighter than it had been all night, a smooth, even grey that seemed to press down on the plain with a soft, diffuse light, and you could see the shapes of the camels and the drovers with more clarity than before, their outlines becoming sharper and more distinct as the minutes passed. The guide had stopped humming, and the bell on the lead camel rang with its steady, patient note, and the breeze from the north continued to blow, cool and clean and empty, pressing gently against the side of your face as you walked. The second half of the night had begun, and you settled into it with the same slow, calm rhythm that had carried you this far, one step after another, under the fading stars and the brightening sky. The well and its circle of rough stones had fallen behind you, shrinking into the darkness until it was no more than a faint, pale speck on the plain, and then it was nothing at all, swallowed by the distance and the lingering night. The caravan moved now through a landscape that was changing by slow, almost imperceptible degrees, the flat, open basin giving way to a long, broad slope of sand that rose before you like a ramp laid down by some patient, ancient hand. This was the beginning of the western rise, the long climb back into dune country after the low, flat stretch of the plain, and you felt the angle of the ground change under your feet, your heels pressing a little deeper into the sand as your body adjusted to the incline. The camels tilted forward into the climb, their heavy heads lowering and their broad feet spreading to grit the softer surface, and the bell on the lead animal chimed with a slightly slower rhythm, each note separated by a longer pause as the pace of the column adjusted to the rising ground. The moon was now behind you and to your right, sinking steadily toward the western horizon, and its light struck the faces of the dunes ahead at a shallow angle that made every ridge stand out with a sharp silver edge and a deep black shadow on its lee side. The world had taken on a different quality under that low-angled light, a quality of strong contrasts and long, stretched shapes, and you could see the texture of the sand in fine detail, every ripple and hollow picked out in pale silver or dark charcoal. Your shadow stretched far out to your left, impossibly long, a thin, dark figure that walked across the sand with the same slow, steady gait as your own body, sometimes climbing up the flank of a nearby rise and then sliding down the other side as if it had its own separate journey to make. The shadow of your staff was a long, sharp line that cut across the rippled surface like a dark scratch on pale stone, and the shadow of the camel ahead of you was a huge, distorted shape that bulged and rippled with every step, its legs stretching into thin, jointed lines that bent at strange angles over the uneven ground. The air had grown noticeably cooler since the well, and you felt it on your cheeks and the tips of your ears, a dry, clean coolness that seemed to sharpen with every step you took upward. You pulled your outer robe more closely around your shoulders, tucking the loose end under your belt so that it would not flap in the small, steady breeze that had begun to stir more persistently from the north. That breeze came across the dunes with a low, faint whistle, a sound that was almost not a sound at all, and it carried the same clean, empty smell that had been with you all night, a smell like old paper left in the sun or sun-warmed stone cooling in the evening. It pressed gently against the side of your face, never growing stronger or weaker, a constant, quiet presence that you noticed only when you thought about it. The guide, walking far ahead at the head of the column, had pulled his own robe tighter as well, and his figure was a small, dark shape against the silver-grey sand, his staff rising and falling with the same measured rhythm it had used since the camp. The sand underfoot was finer here than it had been on the plain, very soft and loose, and walking through it required a slightly more deliberate motion, lifting each foot just a little higher and placing it just a little more carefully. You settled into the new rhythm quickly, your muscles accepting the extra effort without complaint, and you noticed that your footprints behind you were deeper than before, each one a dark bowl-shaped hollow that held its form for a few paces before the loose grain slid down from the edges and began the slow work of filling it. The camel's broad feet left even deeper prints, wide, round depressions that looked like the marks of some great, slow-moving machine, and the line of those prints stretched back across the slope in a long, wavering chain that would last until the next wind came. You glanced back once and saw the track clearly in the moonlight, a dark, dotted line that led all the way down to the plain and then disappeared into the distance, and you turned forward again without any particular feeling, because the desert always kept a record of what passed over it, and the wind always erased it, and that was simply the way of things. The guide's three-note hum had started up again, so quiet that you felt it more than heard it, a low vibration in the air that seemed to come from the sand itself rather than from any human throat. It mixed with the sound of the bell, which rang with a slightly different tone now than it had earlier in the night, its note a little thinner and a little colder as the metal cooled in the night air. You could hear the drovers speaking to the animals in low, quiet voices, the same short phrases repeated again and again. "So stand good now, easy, easy." And the camels responded with small adjustments of their gait, a slight turn of the head, a slow blink of their long-lashed eyes. One of the animals in the middle of the line shook its head, and the brass rings on its harness clinked together with a series of small, bright notes that cut through the deeper sounds of the caravan like tiny stars against a dark sky. The young drover with the blue cloth around his arm walked past you, moving from the front to the rear, and he touched each camel on the shoulder as he passed, his hand making a soft rhythmic sound against the coarse hair. The slope continued to rise, and the dunes on either side of the caravan began to grow taller again, their crests lifting against the starry sky like the backs of sleeping animals. The guide was leading you up a broad, curving ramp of sand that wound between two high dune ridges, and the walls of sand on either side funneled the moonlight down into the corridor so that the whole space was filled with a pale silver glow that seemed almost solid. You could see the fine details of the dune faces, the delicate overlapping scallops carved by the wind, the small dark holes where some creature had burrowed, the long smooth slopes where the sand had slid in a miniature avalanche and then settled into a new stable shape. The camels moved through this glowing corridor, with their heads low and their eyes half closed, their loads swaying gently with each step, and the bell on the lead animal chimed with its thin clear note, the sound bouncing softly off the dune walls and then fading into the deep quiet. You found yourself thinking about the route the guide had chosen, the way it wound through the dunes like a hidden road that only he could see. The direction had changed several times since the well, small, subtle adjustments that you would not have noticed if you had not been watching the shadow shift against the sand and the stars wheel slowly overhead, and you understood that the guide was steering the caravan through a series of invisible gates between the high crests, avoiding the softest sand and the steepest faces. It was the kind of knowledge that came only from walking the same routes year after year, season after season, and you trusted it without needing to understand it, just as the camels trusted the guide, and the drovers trusted the camels, and you trusted the steady, familiar weight of your staff in your hand. The thought drifted away, and you let it go, and you watched the sand change color from pale silver to a slightly warmer gray as the moon sank lower and its light passed through more of the Earth's atmosphere. After a long while, the guide raised his staff and let it fall, and the camels slowed to a halt on a broad, level shelf of packed sand that jutted out from the side of the dune like a natural terrace. The stop was brief, just a pause to let the animals catch their breath after the long climb, and the drovers moved along the line checking the loads and murmuring to the camels, their hands touching each rope and knot with the same patient attention. You took your water skin from your shoulder and drank, and the water was still cool from the well, with that faint, clean taste of minerals and deep earth that made you want to drink more than you needed. You stood still while you drank, your staff planted beside you, and you looked up at the sky, where the stars had wheeled a little further along their slow path, and you noticed that the moon was now very low in the west, its lower edge almost touching the dark line of the dunes behind you. The night was drawing toward its end, though there was still a long stretch of darkness ahead before the true dawn, and the thought passed through your mind without leaving any mark. The guide did not rest during the pause. He stood a little apart from the column, looking up at the sky and then out toward the darker dunes ahead, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something very far away. After a short while he lowered his head and resumed his pace, and the camels stirred themselves and followed, and the caravan moved on, the brief pause slipping back into the deep silence without a ripple. You fell into step, and the rhythm of the walk reclaimed you, the steps, the breath, the bell, the whisper of sand, the cool press of the breeze. The slope continued to rise, though more gently now, and the dune walls on either side began to draw closer together, narrowing the corridor until there was only just enough room for the camels to walk in single file. The sand underfoot was firm and packed, the kind that took a clear print and held it, and your footsteps made a soft, crisp sound as you walked, a sound like a dry leaf being pressed under a thumb. You passed a place where the wind had carved a small, shallow cave into the base of the dune, its entrance a dark, gaping hollow that smelt faintly of cool stone and old dust. The cave was not deep, just a shallow alcove, and it was empty, its floor covered with a thin layer of fine sand that had blown in over many seasons. You glanced at it as you passed, and you saw the tiny, delicate tracks of a beetle leading into the darkness. And then you walked on, and the cave fell behind and was lost in the shadows. The camel ahead of you turned its head and looked at you with its large dark eyes, and then it faced forward again, and the two of you climbed on together, the sand rising underfoot, the moon sinking behind, the night carrying you forward with the same slow, steady patience it had shown all along. The guide's hum had become so quiet that it was barely a sound at all, more like a memory of a sound, a pattern that your mind supplied even when your ears could not catch it. The breeze from the north continued to blow, steady and cool, and the stars overhead were still thick and bright, though a few of the faintest ones near the eastern horizon had begun to fade into the growing light. You could see that light now, a smooth pearl-grey band that had widened and brightened since the well, and you knew that the dawn was coming, though it was still some distance away. The caravan climbed on, and the corridor between the dunes began to open out again, the high walls of sand falling away on either side until you were walking up a broad, open slope that led toward the dark crest of the highest ridge you had seen all night. The guide aimed for the lowest point of that ridge, a shallow saddle between two peaks, and the camels followed him without hesitation, their heavy feet pressing deep into the sand as they climbed the final, steepest pitch of the western slope. The second half of the night was well underway, and you climbed with them, one slow step after another, under the descending moon and the brightening sky. The moon had dropped so low behind the western dunes that its light no longer reached the corridor of sand where the caravan walked, and the world around you had fallen into a darkness that was deeper and more enclosed than any you had moved through all night. The stars overhead were still thick and bright, but they seemed very far away now, cold points of light that did little to illuminate the ground underfoot, and the sand had taken on a deep velvety darkness that made every step a small act of trust. You could still see the shapes of the camels ahead of you, though only just, their broad bodies outlined against the slightly lighter sky, and you could still hear the bell on the lead animal ringing with its thin, clear note. But the sound seemed to come from further away than before, as if the darkness itself was swallowing it before it reached your ears. This was the hour before dawn, the deepest and quietest part of the night, and everything about the caravan had slowed and softened to match it. Your breath had begun to form a faint, brief mist in front of your face, appearing and disappearing with each exhalation, and you noticed that the air had grown cold enough that you could feel it in your lungs, a clean, sharp sensation that was not unpleasant. The tip of your nose was cold, and the tips of your fingers were cold where they gripped your staff, and you tucked your free hand into the loose sleeve of your robe to warm it against the heat of your own body. The sand underfoot had developed a thin, delicate crust, that crumbled with a soft crackle each time you stepped on it, a sound like a dry leaf being pressed under a thumb, and you could feel the crust give way beneath your weight, and then the softer, looser sand below it, shifting to receive your foot. The camel's broad feet made a deeper, heavier sound as they broke through the same crust, a sound that was part crunch and part whisper, and the line of dark, broken patches stretched back along the track behind you like a trail of small disturbances in an otherwise smooth, untouched surface. The guide's pace had slowed by a small, almost imperceptible amount, not from weariness, but from an understanding that the camels were at their sleepiest and that the darkness required a more deliberate, careful progress. You could see his figure far ahead, a darker shape against the dark sand, his staff rising and falling with the same steady rhythm, but a little more slowly, a little more gently, as if he were measuring each step against some internal clock that only he could hear. The drovers had fallen completely silent now, and the only sounds from the front of the column were the soft huff of the camels, the muted chime of the bell, and the occasional low rumbling sound from one of the animals as it exhaled a long, slow breath. One of the drovers, you could not tell which one, was patting the neck of the animal beside him, a rhythmic, muffled sound of hand on coarse hair that repeated over and over with no hurry and no pause, a sound that was as steady and calming as the pulse of your own blood. You noticed that the sand in this part of the dune corridor was marked with a different kind of ripple pattern, one that was broader and flatter than the fine, wispy ripples you had seen earlier in the night. These ripples were spaced about a hand's width apart, and their crests were rounded and smooth, as if they had been shaped by a stronger wind that had blown for a shorter time. Your footsteps fell across them at a slight angle, and each step disturbed several of the ripples at once, pressing a single smooth print into the pattern's surface, and you looked down at the pattern with a quiet, distant attention, the kind of attention that noticed without really noticing, the way you noticed the stars without counting them, or the bell without hearing it. The ripples ran in the same direction for a long while, and then they changed direction subtly, curving around a low, buried obstacle that you could not see, and you understood without thinking about it that the wind here was shaped by the dunes in ways that were too complex to follow. The camel ahead of you stopped for a moment, its heavy head lifting slightly as if it had heard or smelled something that you could not perceive, and you stopped with it, your staff planted on the sand, your breath held without your meaning to hold it. The animal stood perfectly still, its ears swiveling forward and then back, and then it let out a long, fluttering breath that shook the loose skin of its throat and resumed its slow, steady walk. You resumed your walk as well, and the pause had been so brief that you were already moving again by the time your mind caught up to the fact that you had stopped. Whatever the camel had sensed, it was nothing that concerned the caravan, and the guide had not paused or looked back, and the drovers had not stirred from their silent, patient walking. And so you let the moment pass without dwelling on it, the way you let all small, unexplained moments pass during a long night of travel. The corridor of sand began to open out again, the high dune walls on either side falling away so gradually that you did not notice the change until you realized that you could see more stars near the horizon than you had been able to see before. The world was still dark, but the darkness had a different quality now, a quality of space and openness rather than enclosure and closeness, and you felt the air move a little more freely against your face. The sand underfoot had changed as well, becoming coarser and scattered with small dark pebbles that crunched faintly under your steps, and the crust that had been so delicate and crackly in the narrow corridor was gone, replaced by a firmer, more solid surface that took your weight without breaking. You could see the shapes of the dunes ahead, low and rolling, their crests barely rising above the level of your own head, and you knew that the caravan had passed through the highest part of the dune field and was now descending slowly toward the flatter country that lay beyond. You passed a single dead thorn bush that stood at the side of the track, its bare branches bleached white by the sun and scoured smooth by the wind. It appeared so suddenly in the deep gloom that for a single brief moment you almost thought it was an animal, a crouching shape that should not have been there, but your mind corrected itself before the thought could fully form, and you walked past it without pausing. The bush was old and dry, its roots probably reaching down to some deep, forgotten moisture that had not existed for decades, and its branches curled and twisted in shapes that seemed almost deliberate, as if they were reaching towards something that only the bush could see. You glanced at it as you passed, noticing how the starlight caught the pale, smooth surface of the wood and made it glow faintly against the darker sand. And then it was behind you, swallowed by the darkness, and the track ahead was empty again, smooth and unmarked and waiting. The sky in the east had begun to show a definite lightening now, a smooth, dark blue band that held no stars at its lowest edge, and that grew a little wider and a little brighter every time you looked at it. The guide had noticed it too. You could tell by the way he tilted his head slightly every few minutes, checking the horizon, measuring the progress of the dawn against the constellations that were still visible overhead. The stars themselves were beginning to fade, the faintest of them winking out one by one as the sky brightened, and the brighter ones were holding on a little longer, shining with a cold, steady light that seemed to come from very far away. The Milky Way was still visible, but it had grown pale and ghostly, its cloudy band of light thinning and spreading until it was almost indistinguishable from the brightening sky around it. You picked out the Trader's Staff and the North Well, the same constellations you had been watching all night, and you saw that they had wheeled a long way across the sky, their positions telling you that the night was nearly over and the sun was not far below the horizon. The guide's three-note hum had stopped some time ago, and the silence that replaced it was deep and complete, broken only by the bell, the breath, the footsteps, and the faint, distant whistle of the breeze as it moved across the open dunes. The drovers were still silent, and the camels walked with their heads low and their eyes half closed, their bodies moving with a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to belong more to the earth than to any living creature. You felt the weight of your own tiredness now, not a heavy, pressing tiredness, but a light, diffuse one that settled over your shoulders and behind your eyes, making everything seem a little softer and a little further away. You had been walking all night, and your body knew it, but the walking was so familiar and so steady that the tiredness was just another part of the experience, something to be noticed and then let go, like the cold air or the faint, clean smell of the breeze. The ground underfoot had begun to slope downward, a long, gentle descent that led away from the last of the high dunes and toward a wide, flat plain that you could just begin to see in the growing light. The sand was firmer here, packed hard by the wind and scattered with small, smooth stones that glowed faintly in the starlight, and your footsteps made a soft, crisp sound as you walked, a sound that seemed louder than before because the world around you had grown so quiet. The camel's footsteps made the same sound, a rhythmic, crunching beat that mixed with the chime of the bell and the slow, steady huff of their breathing, and the whole caravan moved down the slope with a quiet, unhurried purpose, as if it were a single, large creature descending toward its resting place. You looked back once, turning your head to glance over your shoulder at the way you had come, and you saw the dark shapes of the dunes you had crossed, their crests sharp and black against the fading stars. The track of the caravan stretched back across the sand, a line of dark footprints that led up the slope and disappeared into the shadows between the dunes, and you knew that by the time the sun was fully up the wind would have erased that track, filling the prints with fresh sand and smoothing the surface until it looked as if no one had ever passed that way. You turned forward again, and the thought did not trouble you because the desert always erased what passed over it, and that was simply the way of things, the way it had always been and would always be. The eastern sky had brightened to a smooth, pearl-grey band that stretched across the entire horizon, its upper edge fading into a deep, soft blue that still held a few of the brightest stars. The dawn was coming, and you could feel it in the air, a faint, subtle warmth that was not yet heat, but was no longer the sharp, clean cold of the deep night. The breeze from the north had begun to ease, its steady pressure against your face softening and becoming intermittent, as if it too were settling down to rest after a long night of blowing. The camels seemed to sense the coming day, and they walked with a little more alertness, their ears swiveling forward and their heads lifting slightly, though their pace remained the same, slow, steady rhythm it had been all night. The bell on the lead animal chimed with its thin, clear note, and the sound carried further, now in the open, quiet air, ringing out across the plain and then fading into the vast, still silence. The guide had stopped humming, stopped checking the stars, stopped doing anything except walking steadily forward with his staff rising and falling, and you understood that the navigation was complete, that the route was now so clear and so familiar that he could follow it with his eyes closed. The caravan moved on, and the plain opened out before you, flat and broad and stretching toward every horizon, its surface covered with the same small dark pebbles that had been underfoot for the last hour. In the distance, still very far away but definitely there, you could see a low dark line that was not dunes and was not sky, a line that marked the edge of the plain and the beginning of something else, something that you would reach when the sun was fully up and the night's work was done. You walked toward it with the same slow, steady pace, one step after another, under the fading stars and the brightening sky, through the last, deepest hour before the dawn. Without any clear moment of transition, the world began to reveal itself again, drawn in shades of charcoal and ash that seeped into the darkness from the east, and slowly, patiently spread across the sky, and the sand like water, soaking into dry cloth. You had been walking through the deepest part of the night for so long that your eyes had forgotten what color looked like, and now, as the first true grey light filtered over the plain, you saw the sand ahead of you, not as silver or black or deep blue, but as a warm, muted tan, with faint rosy undertones that you had not seen since the sun went down the previous evening. The stars overhead were fading one by one, the faintest of them winking out, as if they were being gently erased by a careful hand, and the brighter ones lingered a little longer, shining with a cold, pale light that grew thinner and more distant with every passing minute. The Milky Way, which had arched across the sky all night, like a trail of fine sand blown across a dark floor, was now nothing more than a pale, ghostly smear that was barely visible against the brightening blue, and soon it too would be gone, absorbed into the full light of the day. Your footsteps had slowed without you noticing, matching the gradual change in the world around you, and the camels ahead were walking with a softer, more deliberate tread, as if they understood that the night's long work was nearly finished. The bell on the lead animal chimed with its thin, clear note, but the sound seemed different now in the grey light, less sharp and more diffuse, as if the coming day was smoothing the edges off every sound, just as it was smoothing the shadows off the dunes. The drovers had fallen completely silent, and the guide's hum had stopped some time ago, leaving only the soft huff of the camels, the creak of leather, and the gentle whisper of your own footsteps on the cooling sand. The air was still cold, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible warmth beginning to stir within it, a promise that the sun was not far below the horizon and that the long night would soon be over. You looked to the east, where the sky had lightened to a smooth pearl-grey band that pushed upward against the retreating darkness, and you saw that the lowest edge of that band was tinged with a very faint, very pale apricot glow that had not been there the last time you checked. The glow was so subtle that you could only see it when you looked slightly to the side of it, letting your peripheral vision catch the warmth that your direct gaze could not, and you watched it for a long moment while you walked, feeling the first small stirring of the day's arrival in your chest. The guide had noticed it too. You could tell by the way he tilted his head every few minutes, measuring the progress of the dawn against whatever internal clock he carried, and by the way his pace had slowed even further, as if he were deliberately matching his steps to the slow, steady rise of the sun. The plain you had been crossing for the last hour began to change underfoot, the coarse, pebbly sand giving way to a firmer, flatter surface of packed earth and scattered gravel. Ahead of you, a low, broad shelf of exposed limestone jutted from the ground like a natural terrace, its surface pale and smooth and worn by centuries of wind and rare rain. The guide led the caravan directly toward this shelf, and when he reached its edge he stopped and raised his hand once, a small, quiet gesture that was more a suggestion than a command. The camels halted behind him in their slow, rippling wave, and some of them lowered their heads at once, their long necks curving down toward the ground, while others stood with their eyes half closed and their heavy bodies swaying slightly from side to side. The drovers moved quietly among them, but they did not check the loads or adjust the ropes. They simply stood beside their animals, their hands resting lightly on the coarse hair of the camel's shoulders, and they too turned their faces toward the east. You stopped at the edge of the limestone shelf, your staff planted in front of you, and you felt the hard, cool stone under the thin soles of your sandals, a surface that was solid and unchanging after a full night of shifting sand. The shelf rose just a little above the level of the plain, and from this slight elevation you could see the whole eastern horizon spread out before you, a long, flat line where the dark earth met the brightening sky. The apricot glow had grown stronger and deeper, pushing upward into the pearl-grey band and staining it with shades of pale orange and soft rose, and the stars in that part of the sky were completely gone now, swallowed by the light. A few of the brightest stars still hung on in the darker west, cold and distant, and the last thin sliver of the moon was just visible above the opposite horizon, pale as a scrap of cloud, its light so faint that it cast no shadow at all. You stood still and watched the dawn arrive, and there was no conversation, no announcement, no signal of any kind, just a shared, wordless moment while the light grew strong enough to cast faint, new shadows pointing in the opposite direction from the night's long companions. The shadow of your staff fell to your right now, a short dark line on the pale stone, and the shadow of the camel beside you was a broad, solid shape that stretched out toward the west, pointing back along the track you had traveled. The night's shadows had been long and thin and stretched far to the left, but these new ones were shorter and denser, filled with the warm golden light of the rising sun rather than the cold silver of the moon, and they seemed to root you to the ground in a way that the night's shadows never had. The sand around the limestone shelf had taken on its true daytime color, a warm, muted tan with subtle variations of ochre and pale brown, and you could see the texture of it clearly for the first time since the sun had set the evening before. The wind ripples that you had felt underfoot all night were now visible as fine, parallel lines that ran across the surface, and you could see the scattered pebbles and the small, dark seeds and the tiny tracks of beetles that had passed this way in the cooler hours. The dead thorn bush you had passed earlier was a pale, bleached shape in the distance, its branches catching the first rays of the sun and glowing with a faint, warm light, and the dunes you had crossed during the night were a long, low line of soft gold on the western horizon, their shadows still deep and blue-black on their lee sides. Everything looked different in the daylight, not better or worse, just different, and you let your eyes wander over the landscape with a quiet, unhurried attention, noticing the small details that the night had hidden. The guide had not moved from his place at the front of the column, and his figure was now clearly visible in the growing light, his faded wool robe the color of dry earth, his staff planted beside him, his headscarf pulled back from his face to reveal a weathered, patient expression that held no particular emotion. He was looking toward the east with the same calm, unsurprised look he had worn all night, and you understood that he had seen the sun rise from this exact spot many times before, on many different journeys, and that the sight was as familiar to him as the sound of the bell or the feel of the sand under his feet. The young drover with the blue cloth around his arm had sat down on a flat stone at the edge of the shelf, his hands resting on his knees, and he too was watching the horizon with a quiet, relaxed attention, his body still and his breathing slow. The older drover, the broad one, stood beside the led camel with one hand on the animal's shoulder, and the camel had closed its eyes completely, its long lashes resting on its cheeks, its breathing so slow and deep that it seemed almost asleep on its feet. The air had begun to warm very slightly, and you felt the day's first raw warmth touch your cheek, a soft, gentle pressure that was completely different from the cool, dry breeze that had been blowing all night. That breeze had now died away almost completely, leaving the air still and quiet, and the only movement was the slow, steady rise of the sun and the gradual, patient lengthening of the new shadows. You pulled your headscarf away from your face, letting it fall around your neck, and you felt the cool air on your skin for a moment before the warmth of the sun replaced it. The light was growing stronger by the minute, and the colors of the world were becoming richer and deeper, the pale apricot of the horizon deepening into a warm golden orange, the grey of the sky turning into a soft, clean blue that seemed to stretch upward forever. The last sliver of the moon hung above the western horizon for a long moment, growing paler and thinner until it was nothing more than a faint white scratch on the blue, and then it was gone, vanished into the full light of the day without any fuss. You watched it disappear, and you felt a small, quiet sense of completion, as if the night's journey had officially ended with the setting of the moon and the rising of the sun. The caravan had travelled through the darkness, through the dunes and the troughs and the open plains, and now it stood on a solid shelf of limestone in the full light of morning, and everything that had happened during the night seemed very far away, like a story that someone else had told you a long time ago. The camels began to stir after a while, not because they were restless, but because the sun had risen high enough to warm their thick coats, and one of them shook its head so that the brass rings on its harness clinked together with a series of small, bright notes. The sound was startling in the stillness, a sharp, clear noise that seemed to belong to the daytime rather than the night, and it broke the spell of the dawn, though gently, without any sense of interruption. The guide turned away from the horizon and looked back at the column, his gaze moving slowly from camel to camel, drover to drover, until it reached you at the rear. He did not smile, and he did not nod, but there was something in his expression that acknowledged the completion of the night's work, a quiet, wordless recognition that the watch was nearly over and the destination was not far ahead. The young drover rose from his stone and stretched his arms over his head, a slow, lazy motion that made his robe pull tight across his shoulders, and then he walked to the lead camel and murmured something to the animal, patting its neck with a rhythmic, muffled thump. The older drover did the same, and soon all the drovers were moving among the camels, touching a rope here, adjusting a strap there, preparing the caravan for the final short leg of the journey. You stayed where you were for a moment longer, your staff still planted on the limestone, your face still turned toward the warm golden light of the sun, and you let the stillness of the dawn settle into your bones, filling the spaces that the night's walking had left empty. The grey light had given way to full morning. The stars were gone, the moon was gone, and the world was quiet and bright and still, waiting for the caravan to move again. The sun was fully above the dunes by the time the guide raised his staff and let it fall for the last time that night, stirring the camels from their stillness on the limestone shelf and setting the caravan in motion once again. The warmth of the new day had already begun to spread across the plain, softening the sharp edges of the morning chill and drawing thin, pale wisps of vapor from the damp patches where the night's cool air had settled into the hollows. You walked now on ground that sloped gently downward, a broad, easy descent that led away from the limestone shelf and toward a wide, shallow valley that you could see clearly in the full light of the morning sun. The sand had given way entirely to gravel and packed earth, a surface that was firm and solid underfoot, and your staff made a clean, crisp sound each time it touched the ground, a sound that was completely different from the soft whisper of sand that had accompanied you all night. The camels walked with a little more energy now, their heads lifting and their ears swiveling forward, and the brass bell on the lead animal rang with a bright, clear note that carried far across the open ground. The valley opened out before you as you descended, a broad, shallow bowl of packed earth and scattered stones that stretched between two low, rolling ridges, and at the far end of it, still some distance away but clearly visible in the morning light, stood the caravanserai. The building was low and square and made of mud brick, its walls the same warm, dusty brown as the earth itself, and it seemed to grow out of the ground rather than sit upon it, as if it had been there for so long that it had become part of the landscape. Flat-roofed structures with small, deep-set windows clustered behind a high outer wall, and the heavy wooden gate in the center of that wall was already open, swung inward to welcome the early travelers who had arrived before you. A few thin columns of smoke rose from somewhere inside the compound, pale grey against the soft blue of the sky, and they drifted upward slowly, lazily, as if they had nowhere particular to go. You could see the dark shapes of other camels kneeling in neat rows within the courtyard, and the small moving figures of people walking between them, and the whole scene was quiet and orderly and calm, the way such places always were in the early morning. The guide did not change his pace as the caravan approached the caravanserai, and the camels followed him with the same steady, patient rhythm they had used all night, their broad feet pressing deep prints into the packed earth of the track. The drovers had begun to stir themselves, adjusting their robes and their headscarves, speaking to each other in low, quiet voices that you could now hear clearly in the still morning air. The young drover with the blue cloth around his arm had pulled his scarf away from his face, and you could see that he was younger than you had thought, his face smooth and his eyes bright despite the long night of walking. The older drover, the broad one, walked beside the lead camel with one hand resting on the animal's shoulder, and his face was weathered and calm, the face of a man who had made this journey more times than he could count and would make it again many times more. The track led you down into the valley and across its flat, open floor, and the caravanserai grew larger and more distinct with every step. You could see the texture of the mud brick walls now, the rough, uneven surface marked by the handprints of the builders who had shaped them long ago, and you could see the dark, square openings of the small windows, their wooden shutters thrown open to let in the cool morning air. The gate was a tall, arched opening framed by thick wooden beams, and above it a faded, woven awning hung limply in the still air, its colors bleached by the sun to pale shades of ochre and grey. A man in a long dark robe stood just inside the gate, leaning on a staff of his own, and he raised one hand in a slow, casual greeting as the guide approached, a gesture that was returned with the same quiet, unhurried calm. The caravan passed through the gate and into the courtyard, and the world inside the walls was a different world entirely, a world of shade and stillness and the low, steady murmur of human activity. The courtyard was large and open, its floor packed hard by centuries of foot traffic and scattered with clean, pale sand, and around its edges stood low, mud-brick buildings with flat roofs and deep, shady doorways. Other camels knelt in neat rows near the far wall, their loads already removed and stacked beside them, and a few early-rising travellers sat on rolled carpets in the shade of a long wooden portico, sipping tea from small glass cups and speaking to each other in voices that were barely louder than the rustle of the breeze. A date palm grew from the centre of the courtyard, its trunk thick and rough, and its fronds a deep, dusty green, and beneath it a stone trough held water that reflected the pale blue of the sky in small trembling patches. The guide brought his camel to a halt in the centre of the courtyard, and the rest of the column stopped behind him, the animals spreading out slightly, now that they were no longer confined to the narrow track. The drovers began at once to unload the animals, moving with the same quiet, practiced efficiency they had shown all night, coiling ropes, unbuckling straps, lifting the heavy packs of bundled cloth and clay jars and leather sacks, and carrying them to the stack against the courtyard wall. The camels knelt down in their slow, rocking motion as their loads were removed, folding their legs beneath them and settling onto the warm, packed earth with long, fluttering breaths that seemed to express a deep, quiet relief. The bell on the lead camel chimed once more as the animal lowered its head to the ground, and then it was silent, and the only sounds were the soft murmur of voices, the splash of water, and the gentle rustle of the date palm's fronds in the faint morning breeze. You stood for a moment just inside the gate, your staff still in your hand, and you let your eyes adjust to the shade and your body adjust to the stillness. The night's walking was over, and the tiredness that you had been holding at a distance all through the dark hours was now settling over you like a soft, heavy blanket, pressing down on your shoulders and behind your eyes and deep in the muscles of your legs. You walked slowly across the courtyard, your sandals making soft, scuffing sounds on the packed earth, and you found a shaded spot near the date palm where a worn wooden bench sat against the wall. You sat down on the bench, your staff leaning beside you, and you let your hands rest on your knees, feeling the warmth of the sun on the parts of your robe that were not in shade, and the coolness of the wall against your back. Someone came to you after a while, a man in a simple, undyed robe with a clay jug and a small glass cup, and he poured hot, sweet tea into the cup without speaking, the steam rising in thin, curling wisps that caught the morning light. You took the cup in both hands, feeling the warmth spread into your fingers and into your palms, and you held it under your face for a moment, breathing in the smell of the tea, a smell that was earthy and sweet and faintly floral, like dried herbs and honey, and something else that you could not name. You sipped the tea slowly, letting it warm your throat and your chest, and you felt the tiredness in your body begin to ease, replaced by a quiet, comfortable stillness that seemed to spread outward from the cup and fill the whole courtyard. The guide had walked away from the camels and was now sitting on a rolled carpet in the shade of the portico, a cup of tea in his own hands, speaking in a low voice with the man in the dark robe who'd greeted you at the gate. The drovers were finishing their work, stacking the last of the packs against the wall and covering them with a heavy, woven cloth to keep off the dust. And then they too drifted toward the portico, accepting cups of tea from the man with the jug and settling onto the carpets with slow, heavy movements that spoke of a long night's labor. The camels were still and silent in their rows, their eyes closed and their breathing slow and deep, and the other travelers in the courtyard paid no attention to the new arrivals, continuing their quiet conversations and their slow, patient sipping of tea. You finished your tea and set the empty cup on the bench beside you, and you leaned back against the wall, letting your head rest against the cool, rough surface of the mud brick. The courtyard was full of ordinary morning sounds now, the sounds of a place that was waking up slowly and without hurry, water splashing into the stone trough as someone filled a bucket, the low murmur of conversation from the portico, the soft scrape of a broom on packed earth as a boy swept the far corner of the courtyard, the distant gentle clucking of chickens somewhere behind the buildings. The date palm rustled overhead, its fronds shifting in the breeze with a sound like dry paper being turned, and a small brown bird flew from one of the fronds to the top of the wall and then away over the valley. The air smelled of dust and tea and camel, and the faint clean scent of the desert that still clung to your robe, and you breathed it in slowly, feeling each breath settle deeper into your lungs than the last. Through the open gate, you could see the dunes you had crossed all night, soft and golden now in the full light of morning, their shadows blue and cool on their lee sides. They looked very different in the daylight, gentler and less imposing, and they seemed very far away even though you knew they were only a few hours' walk behind you. The track you had followed from the limestone shelf was still visible, a pale, winding line that led back across the valley floor and up into the rolling hills, and you followed it with your eyes until it disappeared among the dunes, knowing that the wind would erase it soon enough and that the next caravan to pass this way would leave its own track in the same sand, as countless caravans had done before and would do again. Your watch was over, and you sat in the quiet shade of the caravanserai with your staff beside you and the warmth of the tea inside you, and you let the stillness of the morning settle over you like a second robe, soft and familiar and calm. There was nothing more to do, and there was nothing more to watch, and so you closed your eyes for a moment, feeling the sun on your feet and the shade on your face, listening to the quiet, ordinary sounds of the inn as it woke around you, knowing that the night's work was done and the desert was at rest and the long, slow journey would continue again when it was time, and not a moment before